Well, good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen, of the 20th century, may I add, and welcome to our talk this morning on land and taxation in Anglo-Saxon England. Now, it's sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages because of the collapse of Rome under pressure from the barbarian tribes. Anglo-Saxon England, nevertheless, contributed greatly to art, culture, law, and taxation. Despite the fact that its pagan culture was mainly oral, so that there are few historical or literary sources available. But the rich legacy they did leave of superb calligraphy in charters and grant deeds for estates granted by the kings, finely wrought jewellery, textiles, even coinage, domestic utensils and tools is quite remarkable to see. One particularly interesting 11th century manuscript, the Tribal Hidage, preserves many of the territorial divisions of the 7th century, noting the number of hides in each. I understand a hide was a unit used for taxation based on the area of land required to support one household, not quite the poll tax or the council tax. And I suspect we should be hearing more about hides from our speaker. By way of a little aside, Anglo-Saxon village life was organised under a crude form of the manorial system, which was refined by the Normans, consisting of three classes which differed in their legal and economic status: freemen, villeins, and cottars or boarders. The villeins were the most numerous and important class and had to work 3 days every week on their lord's land as a service, thus predating Edward Heath's 3-day week by nearly 1,000 years. It appears that the development from an oral to a tradition of literary Christian scholarship arose from the church, persuading newly converted rulers that a written law code was an essential contribution to a civilized Christian king. The 9th century saw the reign of Alfred, the only king the English called great, and around whom legends have gathered. But behind the mythology, his remarkable achievements can still be distinguished, including a massive revival of learning and a political unity which provided a history of the Anglo-Saxons since their arrival in England. And that reminded me, when preparing these notes, of an old Chinese saying, which runs, "To understand today, you must know about yesterday." For a nation to flourish, it's vital for its citizens to know about its origins, traditions, history, and what it values. Witness the situation in the erstwhile Soviet Union. As a kind of homily of what may happen should a nation neglect its heritage, I'd like to read a short extract of a speech from Shakespeare's Richard II, given by John of Gaunt in Act 2, Scene 1, line 40. It begins like this: "This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle," and goes on to conclude, "This land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out, I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm. England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself." Well, there's one man certainly who will be much aware of all this, and he is our speaker this morning, Sir Kenneth Jupp, High Court judge, retired from the bench, but he has not retired from life. A man brimming with energy and full of enthusiasm, who's given much of his time and experience to continue his examination into what we might colloquially call, in fact, I think he called it that, what's it all about? How does the world work? Now, I've had a look at his entry in Who's Who, which immediately follows that of his older brother, now sadly deceased, and it is full of achievement. I won't give you his date of birth, except to say it belies his appearance. Here are just some of the many entries. He completed his education at University College at Oxford with first-class honours and a college prize in Greek. After a distinguished career in the army during the 39-45 war, he was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn in 1945. Queen's Counsel, 1966. Bencher, 1973. Appointed High Court Judge and knighted, 1975. And the presiding judge, North East Circuit, 77 to 81. Yet meeting and talking to Sir Kenneth, which I had the good fortune to do, brought it all to life, and what a difference that made. for I was able to discover something about his childhood, youth, and experience. I found in our conversation that although nobody in his family had had any connection with the law whatsoever, he knew from the age of 10 that he wanted to be a barrister. How was this? An uncle who was an hotelier had a solicitor friend of whom he saw quite a lot. Young Kenneth, if I may make so bold, as a boy often visited his uncle, had long talks with the solicitor, with whom he stayed up late, often until midnight, listening to enthralling stories about the law, which had a great influence on him. Again, as a young person, he was saddened by witnessing poverty and riches side by side, and this aroused in him the desire to discover the causes, and so his interest in economics began. This was helped by his grandfather, a remarkable man, who devoted himself to good works in the Tower Hamlets Mission in Stepney, East London, where Sir Kenneth played the flute in an orchestra, and where aunts of his were musicians and singers. I think he said they became members of the Royal Academy. Am I right there?
Two of them were professors of singing.
Among his other studies was that of language, and members of the school here present will be glad to know it includes Sanskrit. With his excellent family background for the development of his mind, which was undoubtedly bright and alert from the word go, the world must have opened up for him, a great education in itself. He was principal of this school for some years and remains its very good friend, being also a patron of the Independent Education Association, which includes St James Day School. He's given a large part of his life to the service of an important arm of government, namely law and justice. There's been a lot of comment about judges recently, but if Sir Kenneth is anything to go by, then we have very little, if anything, to fear from that quarter. When asked if he would talk to the school, his answer was immediate, no thinking, and affirmative, but he added, as long as it's not about the law, I can't stand it. On your seat, you'll find some notes which will be helpful as the talk unfolds. But it's now time for me to ask you to welcome our guest speaker this morning, whom we're privileged to have address us, Sir Kenneth Jupp.
Well, Geoffrey, it's very kind of you to say all those things. I can't say they're altogether untrue, but I think they're much too flattering. Now, I propose to imitate the excellent talk given before Christmas by Peter Watson, when he started off with what the Michelin guide would call un peu d'histoire. I don't think, as Geoffrey has just said, that you can really understand anything if you don't know at least something about its history. So on your sheet of dates there, you'll see that it starts with the year 410, when it's true to say that the Western world was absolutely shattered by the news that the Visigoths under Alaric had sacked Rome. And you see the thing was repeated by the Vandals in 455. You have to go back to China to see why this happened. I'll only say that I've got here the Times Atlas of World History with a marker at the page where you'll see where all the nomadic races of the very, very eastern end of what has recently been the Soviet Empire were deserting the good land they had there in order to find new land. And land is the very center of all, in the end, that I'm going to say here. There was good fertile land there, but of course there were nomadic tribes, and nomads require enormous acreages on which to graze their flocks and herds, and in which to hunt for their other foods, and so on and so forth, and to cull wild things. The result was, nobody knows why this happened, but it was perhaps only just a population explosion. The land wasn't enough. One supposes that. Anyway, mounted on their tiny ponies, and firing bows and arrows, bows made of bone, they were quite invincible when they simply weren't an army. They were just a horde, and so they're called, of people going west, and of course, killing anybody who resisted them. You therefore have Avars, Alans, Huns, and so forth coming out of those remote places to the north of Manchuria. In fact, they went southwards in part and founded a dynasty in the north part of China. They tipped over into Tibet. They tipped over into India. They tipped over into Persia. But the main punch was westwards, where they disturbed the more agricultural populations, and the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Vandals came charging westwards again, and set in motion Slavs, Croats, Serbs, and Lombards, and pushed against the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was only after keeping them out by sheer force of arms, had to adopt the policy of letting them settle, and but keeping them in small groups who couldn't band together in war, and putting many of them under treaty to defend the frontier of Rome against the succeeding waves of invasion. Such settlers were called foederati, foedus meaning a treaty in Latin, or laeti, the etymology of which escapes me. But the foederati and laeti, therefore, were settlers in the Roman Empire in order to defend it. Moreover, the Romans engaged large numbers, ultimately, of particularly Germanic people, young men, in their armies, until there were not only auxiliary troops, which were foreigners to Rome, but there were actual Germans in large numbers in the legions themselves. Now, all that affected this country, our country, in this way, that the final wave of these westward going tribes, as you'll see on this map, were the Jutes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Frisians, all of whom came westward to the eastern part of England. But in the they were called, and the name started up in Scotland, I think, when the Scots called those who were in East Lothian the Sassenachs. And the Romans picked that up and called them Saxons, though not in the least does it follow that any of them were Saxons. I think some were, but they were all called Saxons. It's rather the way we call everything a Hoover, even if it's made by Electrolux or Goblin. Well, the next date you see is 429. The Romans had been withdrawing legions from Britain and giving up its defense gradually, but in 429 they actually abandoned the defense of England, or Britain, I should call it. It wasn't England at all, of course, Britain, and left it to the Britons to get on with it. Well, it's quite likely that the Britons tried to defend the thing with Saxons and failed. And the story of Hengist and Horsa belongs to that idea. One needs to realize that when the Romans left, there were 40,000 troops, Roman troops in England, in Britain. And when they left, it caused the most fantastic economic collapse. Not only were the soldiers missing as customers, but the support of soldiers, what is in modern days called logistics, was enormous. There were state factories producing all sorts of things, Roman state factories for the soldiers, for the army in Britain. And of course, army goes, factories collapse. And there was, as I say, and besides which, the administration, which was huge, the bureaucracy, that too was withdrawn. And it's only recently that historians have realized how devastating the economic collapse was. Well, as you see on your date, 20 years later, 449, there were large-scale so-called Saxon invasions. That date mentioned because that was the date of a petition for help to the Roman governor in Gaul, a petition that met with no success, and the Britons were left to their own devices. Well, there was undoubtedly fighting at that stage and a withdrawal of the Celtic population of Britain westwards in front of this invasion, but it was stopped in a battle at Mons Badonicus, that's the Roman name, of course, in about 500, give or take 10 years. The site of that, I think it's now fairly well established, is a place called Badbury, close to Swindon. That was the end of the first phase of the Saxon invasions. But we now need to ask how they came. Well, they came in bands of some kind, or you might call it gangs, or you might call it tribes. Or the people who came westward to push the Celts back might have been the Saxons already settled in England, in the way I've said, the Foederati and the Laiti, who by that time had been grouped together under a Roman comet, a count, who was known as a Count of the Saxon Shore. Now, the started, I don't know how to finished up opposite the island of there was the port is where the port, well, there's a port there, in fact, they're not Saxon port. But anyway, that was the Saxon shore. And the part of the Saxon shore was in charge of that and a similar part of Saxon shore on the French coast, roughly where you go across for taking the line trip and so on. And the two together formed one defense, but all defended to some extent by legions in reserve, but mostly by the Foederati and Laiti. Now, some of the Saxons who came across at that time as invaders would be pirates, perhaps only one ship, perhaps 3 ships. Some would be whole tribes, and some would be parts of tribes who in successive inroads would begin to inhabit a part of the country and set up all over the place. A good example of that, if you know it, is the word roding in Essex. There are 9 rodings in Essex: Abbess roding, Aythorpe roding, Barrack roding, Beecham roding, Berners roding, High roding, Lead roding, Margaret roding, and White roding. Well, now, the origin of the word roding, there's a river of the name too, is Hrode, or Hrode, I should say, Hrode, which is a personal name. So Hrode with the ing, Hrode's people made all these settlements, and it covers, I think, 20 miles of in Essex. You can see it there today. You must decide for yourself just quite how it came in. Were some of the Hrodings people who'd settled as part of the forces of the Count of the Saxon Shore, were some of them pirates who'd started there and had their relations come following them. But all one knows is that they must all, in the end, have been kith and kin of someone called Rhoda, who was their leader. Whether he was their king, you can't tell. Do you get the idea? Well, now, look at the word king. Some of them were large enough, undoubtedly, to be under a king. Now, where's the chalk and the blackboard? Oh, I see. The chalk there. Oh, oh, well, we can work out at the top there. I'm not going to have time with it. But the origin of the word king is skinny. Now, that becomes it sounds like the U in French lead or lead, skinny. And that changes into a G. Now, what it means, kin is our word for kin. That is to say, a people of the same kin. The clan is the best word to describe these people rather than tribe. And indeed, I think there's an etymological connection between the word kin and the word clan. At any rate, the son of the tribe, if you like, the son of the clan, the Zion of the clan, is what the Oxford Dictionary, well, they say Zion of the tribe, I think, is what the kinnick was, and hence the word king. As a matter of interesting etymology, it later became mixed up with the word to know, kunnen, and it was thought to come from kunnen, and know as in dear Ken John Peel, that's Ken, which is not, of course, Gaelic. In Gaelic, it's twig. And therefore, the wise man, the man of power and wisdom and knowledge, that's not the right etymology, though it came to be thought so later. Now, the king leading them gave rise ultimately to a whole lot of kingdoms in England, which it was now almost beginning to be called. And of the kings, one would be the leading king, or in Irish history, he was always called the High King. The word in Anglo-Saxon is Bretonwald, which you've got down on your list. And the first Bretonwalder was Kent, the second was Northumbria, the third Mercia, and the last in succession, Wessex. And the great date in 829, we've gone through 4 centuries, you gather, from 410, was Egbert, who was crowned at the little village of Dor, just to the north, no, the southwest, is it? No, I'm not sure, of Sheffield, just at the bottom of the Pennines. It was made very easy by him to become the King of England instead of merely the Bretonwalder, because by that time the Danes were landing. They were the next lot of pirates. Now, an interesting thing is that the Jutes came from Jutland, which is the top of the Danish peninsula. The Saxons came from the German coast between the Elbe and the forgotten it. Never mind. The Elbe and the Weser, that's right. The Angles came from the angle between, where the coast goes like that. And the Frisians, and that's why they're called the Angles, and the Frisians came from those islands off what is now Holland, near Heligoland. The Frisians are an interesting lot because they traded with Britain, obviously, long before the Romans left. Large quantities of coins of Frisian origin have been found, and Brito-Roman coins found in Frisia. And the Frisian language is virtually the same as the Old English, which ultimately became the language we speak. So that there must have been a colossal collection. But Bede, the historian, whose city has just been made a city today, or it's announced in the paper this morning, he was born in Sunderland. The Venerable Bede really only mentions three, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, and for long historians thought the Frisians hadn't got much to do with it. But they must have had a great deal to do, as these recent finds show. At any rate, the Danes coming made it easier for Wessex to take over and their king to become king of all England. Now, the next important date, and I must get through this quickly or I can't get on to what I've come to talk about, is St. Augustine's landing in Kent, going to Canterbury, getting in touch with the Queen of Kent, who was already a Christian. She was a Frank from Normandy, and converting first Kent and subsequently the different kingdoms of England. By 600, incidentally, as you'll see on your list, there were only 7 kings left: Kent, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Essex, and Sussex. All the others had been merged. The last to go being Wicker, which became Worcestershire, and Moganland, isn't it, or something like that, which became Hereford. But they were all merged together into these 7. St. Augustine's arrival is terribly important because up to this date, the Anglo-Saxons had not been able to read or write. But that doesn't mean, as it was always taken to mean until about 30 or 40 years ago, that they were uncultured. People are only now beginning to understand that reading and writing can be disastrous to culture. Especially, you've only got to think of Maxwell and the Daily Mirror, and you've only got to think of the so-called serious programs on television to realize that they can kill education and conversation. So they were by no means uncultured, but they simply couldn't read or write. By the way, the authority for what I've just said about reading and writing is Platonic. It comes from the Phaedrus. It's a disaster. Well, reading and writing was a great help, and by 663, the Synod of Whitby, the whole of England virtually had been converted to Christianity. There were 2 lots, well, I won't go into the 2 lots of Christianity, but there were the Celts and there were the St. Augustine Romans, and they settled their differences, not too satisfactorily, at the Synod of Whitby. Now, all this is to show that the modern idea is, and it's probably about right, that the conquest, first of all, was extremely slow, took centuries. Secondly, it was in 4 stages. First of all, the settlements under treaty on the Saxon shore, and how far the Saxon shore spread inland so far as the giving of land and the settling of people is not at all clear, but it probably went a very long way. Certainly up level with London, and maybe even further. Some have said that it went up to the Goring Gap on the Thames, settlements of Saxons. But I think that's going too far. The second sort of wave was something on a large scale, and probably that was conquest, in 449, as you see on your sheets. The stopping of any further advance by the Battle of Mons Badonicus, and then finally a consolidation period when the people on the border, on the marches, in other words, the Mercians, you get the etymology, the Mercians were gradually pushing towards Wales and settling more and more land, half peaceably, half by violence perhaps, in the later times. The strange thing is that except for the things like Mons Badonicus and one, two things like that, there is no real trace of fighting. And yet you think that's the one thing that everybody would have been talking about, battles and so forth, because they do stand to be retained in the memory of people, whether in writing or in legend. But the signs of fighting are, well, of course, there's some signs, but are comparatively few. The three stages, I better leave this out, but in fact, the river names, which are a great part of Anglo-Saxon history, place names and river names, the river names show three widges of names across the country, with all Anglo-Saxon there, most Anglo-Saxon there, and as you go east, all Celtic, like Avon and so forth in the west. Well, Egbert reigned for 37 years, as you see, his son Ethelwulf for 19, his three sons, 2, 6, and 5 years each, the Danes now coming in vast numbers, until the fourth son of Ethelwulf, Alfred, became the Great in 871. The date 901 for his death appears in history books variously at 901, 900, or 899. I haven't bothered to find out quite, except that it's to do with the change of the calendar, what is the correct date. The encyclopedia gives 901, so I put that in. Now, his reign was distinguished by 9 battles south of the Thames with the invading Danes, and they undoubtedly did invade. He spent 5 years then reorganizing the peasant levies called the Fiat, and starting to build an English fleet. The fleet wasn't very successful for the most part. So it won a great battle off the Isle of Wight, as you'll all know. But by 878, by 877, the Danes raided his palace at Chittenham. He retired to Athelney, and the cakes were duly burnt. And in 878, he was able to come out of his retirement at Athelney in Somerset and routed the Danes at the Battle of Edington and captured London in 886. Now the Danes, or rather the King of East Anglia, who ruled, was the chief Danish warrior, was Guthrum. Guthrum and Alfred made a treaty which is quite one of the most remarkable things in the whole of the history of treaties, because Alfred was completely generous to him. He persuaded him to become a Christian. Alfred stood godfather to him. He gave to the Mercians the London that he, Alfred, had captured. It had always been more or less a Mercian city. And he really gave way completely, and the Danelaw and the Wessex were given a boundary which roughly runs up the M1 in modern terms. All to the northeast of that is Danelaw, all to the southwest is Wessex. Now, he was a great strategist, was Alfred, and he introduced the system of founding forts where the men who are going to fight the Danes could be in a secure position and then rush out at the right time to fight the Danes. Actually, it was what the Danes were doing when they came in. They made forts, and then waited, and they were impregnable until they came out, and then, of course, they won their battles. Well, Alfred turned the tables on them. He spent all his taxation, and at last we're coming towards it, on good works. Half the revenue went on education. And now, not only the clerics, the monks, and so on, could read and write, but everybody in Alfred's court had to learn to read and write. Alfred himself translated Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, some parts of the Bible, into Anglo-Saxon, and he restored the monasteries and convents and taught imported scholars and craftsmen, and taught the sons of the nobility reading and writing. And he issued a law code and started the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So now you have an Anglo-Saxon England, which was literate, learned, with books, and so on and so forth. Well, we can finish off your history on the sheets there. 3 sons of Alfred, 30 years between them. Then 5 more Saxon kings, including Ethelred the Unready. He alone reigned 37 years, a disaster. The nadir, as it's been said, of the British monarchy, of the English monarchy, I should say. And then in 1016, the Saxon pretenders to the throne of England were so bad that Canute was successfully, the Dane, was successfully elected king. And he and his 2 sons reigned until 1042, when again we had a Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, for 24 years up to 1066. And I expect you know what happened then. Now, there is an exhibition in the British Museum at the moment, which goes on till the 8th of March, called The Making of England, Anglo-Saxon Art and Culture between the years 600. Now, you remember St. Augustine, 597, and 900, death of Alfred, you see. And the guidebook says this: the 300 years between St. Augustine's mission to convert the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity and King Alfred's death saw the production in England of some of the greatest works of medieval art and learning. Beautiful jewelry, finely written, beautifully bound books with richly illuminated chapter headings are all evidence of a highly cultivated, sensitive, and wealthy society. This picture of Anglo-Saxon England is completely new. When I learned about history at school, the Anglo-Saxons were regarded as savage, unimaginative, seafaring warriors, eking a poor living from the soil and avoiding living in the towns and cities that the Romans had left. The Dark Ages, it was called, but the only reason for calling it dark was that the buildings were of wood, and so they didn't survive, except for a few stone churches. Very little had been dug up. There were no metal detectors in my school days. And it was, as I said, an oral society, no reading and writing. And people in those days thought if you couldn't read and write, you really were just damned ignorant. It's just not true. As you'll, that's another lecture. Well, now, as quoting from the museum catalogue again, by AD 600, Anglo-Saxons had been living in England for 5 or 6 generations, one of the most obscure and argued over periods in British history. And it's true. The revolution in history came in 1939, when the Sutton Hoo burial ship was dug up, a fantastic treasure. However, that didn't very much affect things because it had to be hidden away during the war, and it wasn't until after the war that they really were able to look into it And of course, it is a fabulous treasure. I better not expound on it too much, but it certainly showed a very wealthy, very widely connected, there are bits of jewelry from Byzantium, for example, in it, very widely connected, European-oriented Anglo-Saxon England, which is quite amazing to what I learned at school. But it was then Sir Frank Stenton's book, which was published in 1943, and if I may, which revolutionized historians' thinking. He showed that the Anglo-Saxons sent missionaries to Frisia, South Germany. St. Boniface was an Anglo-Saxon. An English bishop was Bishop of Salzburg. Alcuin from Northumberland was taken in by Charlemagne to head the school at his palace in Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle. The Anglo-Saxon influence, I'm quoting again, was at the very center of the continental revival of learning known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Now the change, oh dear, I must leave that out. By the way, yes, I'll just tell you quickly, you can ask me. But you know, the Ordnance Survey map of Anglo-Saxon England of 1935 had to be scrapped in 1966 with all the forest vanished. And the map has this inscribed on it: wider knowledge of human distribution in that period shows that most of the natural wooded areas carried much larger populations than was thought possible 30 years ago. In any case, the ancient equipment for cutting and removing timber was not greatly different from that which was commonly used in this country as late as the 18th century. And it was, in fact, studies of Domesday Book showed that we'd been putting forests on the map for Anglo-Saxon England. I mean, officially for the Ordnance Survey, it's really rather funny, in places which are absolutely covered with villages, with their open fields and all that sort of thing. Anyway, so they changed it all and issued a new map without the, I've got that here, incidentally, for you to look at in this map of Anglo-Saxon England. You'll see that the author, it's a recent book, has put the Stenton's, Sir John Stenton's forests and the Ordnance Survey forests and shown them how different they are. The history of England, as you can gather, ended in dynastic upsets. Ethelred the Unready, whom Professor Toyne said was a disastrous. Incidentally, I got Professor Toyne's book, a little book. I haven't used it very much, I'm afraid, for this lecture, but I brought it so that you could see it. I got it out of the library. It was written in 1991. That's the point. And he is an expert, and it's very short. And if you wanted something to read, that's the one. If you're wanting to know how the archaeology has gone on, this book also is up to date. Not quite so up to date as that, but it's fairly up to date. And of course, the archaeology is coming in all the time. I think this is as long ago as 1971. So there'll be a lot since, but it shows you how things are changing. They thought, he points out that they thought that the Anglo-Saxons lived in hovels. We now find they lived in fine houses, only they happened to be made of wood. And 1016 to 1042, I'm quoting from Toyne now, saw no fewer than 4 changes of dynasty. Formerly, this was taken as a symptom of deep-rooted malaise in English affairs. I'm quoting Professor Toyne. But deeper investigation has proved this view false. It is now universally recognized that by 1066, England was one of the best developed monarchies and probably the wealthiest in Western Europe. And of the schools of thought on Anglo-Saxon England, Professor Toyne tries to keep in the middle. There are some people who are far more optimistic than that, some more pessimistic. He gives examples. The system of taxation was basically simple, but effective. A remarkable, I'm quoting all the time, a remarkably successful currency underpinned the general financial expertise of the country. Production and control of the currency was a model for other communities, particularly Scandinavia. I quote again, in its secretarial as well as its financial aspects, late Anglo-Saxon England showed some advanced features. It had the most efficient and uncorrupt civil service in the Western world. That is not Professor Toyne. It's a citation from memory and not quite accurate that I can't now find. But that's why the monarchy survived not only the four dynastic changes of the 10th century, but the disastrous civil war in Stephen's reign, Stephen-Matilda business. I shall omit the detail about the currency and the secretarial thing, except to say that there was a most remarkable, I was going to give examples of it, what we would now call bureaucracy. England was divided into shires, I mean, it's shire in Welsh. Shire Meirioneth. Yes, in shires, some of them based on the old kingdoms, Kent, Sussex, and so on, and Wicker and Morgan, that is Hereford, and some round a headquarters of a Danish invasion, in particular what are called the 5 boroughs. I don't know that I can recite them. Lincoln, Newark, Derby, Nottingham. I'm not sure, that's only 4, isn't it? I can't remember the other. Now, in the shires, there was a shire court, which met twice a year. The shires were divided into hundreds. There are other names for certain parts of the country, which I'll go into, but hundreds I'll take. And Sir John Stenton says, one of the most difficult problems of Anglo-Saxon history is the origin of the institution known as the 100. Was it 100 families, or was it 100 hides, which, as Mr. Lewis said, was enough land to support 100 families? By a law of King Edgar, the 100 court had to meet every 4 weeks. It dealt with all sorts of things like theft and raising the firt, that's the levy of soldiers, but above all, it dealt with taxation. Well, now I'll come to the question of taxation. What are we going to do? Oh, would you like some water? No, I don't drink it. The taxation has been described correctly as a demonstration of the genius for government of the Anglo-Saxon people. I must take Wessex first, and then take the other 4 divisions of the country and just show the differences, which are only verbal. Wessex was divided into the shires, had been for hundreds of years, in fact, divided into shires and hundreds, which were used in taxation. The unit of taxation was the hide. Professor Toyne says the shire court and the 100 court provide the most enduring testimonial, short of the monarchy itself, to positive Anglo-Saxon success in the art of government. The system was a system of land tax called a yelt. The G's in Anglo-Saxon are pronounced Y before front vowels, E and E. It comes from an Anglo-Saxon verb yelden, which means to give, and is the etymological root of our word yield. Now, there was the Danegeld, which was the money given to the Danes. There was the Heergeld, which was the money to pay for a soldier or sailors and soldiers for the armed forces. There was the Burgergeld, Burgergeld, the money paid to fortify and man the boroughs or forts. You remember Alfred set 25 forts around Wessex to keep the Danes off. Had to raise the money to do it. But there were many other things that yelts were raised for. 300 hides were raised for one ship for the Navy. 8 hides for a helmet and corselet for the army. These are only the little relics that have been found in documents here and there, and one has to piece the thing together like a detective story. But, and this is important, the Danegeld only originated as money to pay the Danes. It was used, like Hoover again, for goblins and electroluxes and everything else. It was used for all taxes, a Danegeld. When I tell you that the Norman kings and the Angevin kings all levied Danegelds, and the last was levied, though it was then called by the Danish name carucate, by Henry III. Henry of Huntingdon, the 12th century historian, put it this way: we now pay to our kings by custom what used to be paid to the Danes out of unspeakable terror. It's nice, isn't it? Now, it was paid at a standard rate per hide. For example, 2 shillings per hide, or £1 per hide. In Wessex, I keep to Wessex, it was in fact 2 shillings a hide in the Edward the Confessor's time. Now, the central government, this bureaucracy, assessed each shire as worth so many hides. And in this book, there's a diagram, map sort of diagram, I'll get it marked out later, which shows the result of the county hidage. That is a book which is on view in this British Museum. It doesn't belong to the British Museum, but it's been brought into this exhibition that I mentioned. You can actually see the county. You won't be able to read it, but because it's a manuscript job, but it's very difficult. You couldn't read it, but you will at least see the physical object there. So each county is worth so many hides. Do you get it? The next thing is that I called it county, they were shires at that time. Each shire in the shire court then distributed the number of hides allotted to the county to the hundredths. Do you see? And in each hundred, the 100 court divided the assessment amongst the individual villages. And then in each village, and note the strength of local assessment here at each stage by the people who knew what their neighbors were worth. In each village, they said, you'll pay so many, and you'll pay so many, and you'll pay so many of each hide. And this might, for example, be, I think it's more likely to be a 100 meeting than a village meeting. Too many people for most villages, I think. But you'd say, well, now look here, your land, and it was collected in particular, and I may get a chance to tell you about this, to build Offa's Dyke, 149 miles of Dyke, which is 6 foot deep, 12 foot high, so that if you got over the 6 foot ditch, you then have to climb 12 plus 6, which is 18 foot wall if you cared to do it under fire. Two final quotations. Sir John Stenton. These are relics of the first system of national taxation to appear in Western Europe. Again, regional variation and complexities in methods of assessment, that's referring to the carucates, the changes of nomenclature, notably in East Anglia, that's Leeds, you see, should not obscure the basic fact that England was accustomed to a regular national system of taxation. Well, the three existing books actually demonstrate the system of taxation. They are the County Hidage. I'll leave that out, however, because it's suspect. Nobody knows whether it shows a pre-conquest position or a post-conquest position. And in any case, they cannot understand the figures. They can't reconcile them with the other books. I think it's because they haven't yet fully grasped and been persuaded by the fact that the whole object of taxation is to discover the value of the land. If they'd got that idea in mind, I think they'd probably be able to do it. The second is the tribal hidage, dating from the 8th century, and that is in the British Museum at the moment, in that exhibition I mentioned, and a diagram of it is in this. That shows you the map there, and here the hidages of the different counties. Number 34, for example, this great block here, has, that is West Saxena. And this little chap there is number 5, that's Elmedzethna. Now you see all these little kingdoms and so forth were still operating at the time of that map, 8th century. Then there's the Burghal Hidage, which is what financed the boroughs, which were built, here they are, to keep the Danes out. And here is a sort of slide rule system for deciding how much tax anybody pays. If you can understand that, you're cleverer than I am. But the Saxons apparently understood it. Now, I'll give you my little thing on it, which is very simple arithmetic. You've heard, if you're old enough, of a rod, pole, or perch, I take it. Hands up those who've never heard of a rod, pole, or perch. Oh, that's good. I thought everybody dealt in meters. A rod, pole, or perch is 5.5 yards. But all these measures were used also as square measures. But I'm talking at the moment about length measures. Multiply by 4, and you have 22 yards, which is, one or two of you may know, the length of a cricket pitch. And I take it that even more know that it's a chain. So that a pole is 1/4 of a chain. And you will also know, of course, that 10 chains is 220 yards, which is a furlong. When in my school days, we ran the 220 yards. I don't suppose you do nowadays. So pole, chain, furlong. Good. Now, a chain times a furlong is a furrow long. That's the origin of the word furrow long. And a chain wide, and that's an acre. Because if you multiply 220 by 10, oh no, that can't be right. No. 220 by 22, that's it. You get 4840, which is the very easy number to remember of square yards to the acre. I can't understand what you get in a hectare at all, or hectare, some people call it. Now, the Burghal Hidage, you'll see it in here, shows that an acre's breadth, that is to say a chain, was to be maintained by 16 hides of taxation. Assume one man per had to be cent per hide, or the cost of 1 man per hide, then you've got 4 men per pole, 160 men per furlong, and 1,920 men for 12 furlongs. 12 furlongs would be 1.5 miles, wouldn't it? Yes. Now, these measurements agree, if you allow for rounding up only, with the actual measurement of the city and borough walls. You can measure it on the ground, you see. Look at the book, and it all comes out. Hence that slide rule thing. Winchester, for example, the walls of Winchester were 3,280 yards round. The Burghal Hidage assessed them at 3,300. So it's rounded up from 280. Wareham, which is another instance taken, is 2,180 yards round on the ground and 2,200 rounded up again in the Burghal Hidage. And that's how the assessment was done, as that book in the British Museum exhibition shows. Have I said enough to make that fairly clear? Dr. Hill, who is another expert, a modern expert, who is the author of this mapping, the whole document is a piece of early mathematics which can be seen to work from the complex conversion table, that's the thing I can't understand, to the totals at the end of the text, which I do understand. It is doubtful if even now we've realized its full significance in relation to the development of royal government. The Old English system of assessment, I'm still quoting, has been described, this is Stenton, has been described as cumbrous, over-elaborate, and inequitable. It may be admitted that its details are extremely complicated. The intricate combination of assessment units into neat blocks of 5 hides or 6 carucates, you see that's the decimal or the duodecimal system, sometimes looks like the result of a game with figures. Nevertheless, as a piece of large-scale financial organization, it has no parallel in the Dark Ages. For all its apparent rigidity, it enabled the king to vary the weight of and incidence of his demands as the needs of the moment required. Now, there's a specific historical example of that. When William the Conqueror raised his first tax on this system, he made allowances for the fact that after Hastings, his army had devastated the country as he did a big left-hand hook round London into the north and down into London. That would take him, I think, through Surrey, Berkshire, Hertfordshire a bit, perhaps, or something like that, you see. And he changed the hidage assessment of those counties which he'd ravaged on the way. He didn't so much ravage them, but living off the country had ruined them. And I'd just like to add what none of the commentators seem to have added, that this was not a tax on wealth. It was a tax on means. Unfortunately, today, a means tax, and I don't intend a pun by this, means how much you've got. In those days, in the way I'm using it, it's how much opportunity you've got to get. So that if you were a bad farmer, you'd still pay the same tax because your hides would be the same as the good farmer, who would regard the tax as really quite light because he farms so well, he gets a lot out of it. That seems to me to be the crux of the matter. Historians are able to illustrate the flexibility at the level of the Crown and Council that William's, the first devastated areas, you see, for example, changing the hidage. But it seems to me, since we do know that they were distributed between the hundreds at the shire court. They were distributed between the villages at the hundred court level. A flexibility exists at each level. Because as I think I tried to demonstrate earlier, you can say, well, we've had a flood in the west of the county, so we must reduce their hidage, etc., right down to old so-and-so, you know, poor chap, his father died, he's only just taken over. This is at the village level, you see, so really, he better not pay quite so much this year, and so on. It seems to me incredible. Now, the question you're all asking in your minds, I would think, is this. Why was this admirable system of taxation not the basis of a gradually evolving taxation of land value? Well, I must be very quick on this. There were three main features. First of all, it ran in parallel, especially later under the conquerors, with the feudal system, where the taxation was raised in the form of dues paid for sergeantry, which is service, or sometimes in money, as in scutage, for example, which was running alongside it. Do you get me? Secondly, inflation was going on, and the 20-shilling knight's fee, when it became much better for the king to have the money than the knight, because he couldn't keep the knight to go to Palestine and back, or to do a campaign in Normandy for personal service. So he liked the money. And of course, the knight preferred to stay at home and quaff the ale or whatever they did. And so he was quite happy to pay. So scutage was very popular. It was fixed in, I think, William I's time at 20 shillings. And that was enough to hire a knight instead, which suited everybody. But of course, you only had to wait for about 50 years, and you had to add a bit to the 20 shillings to get a knight. And after a century or two, it wouldn't even buy his breakfast. So inflation. And thirdly and lastly, and perhaps most important of all, the towns were not included. The borough hidage, you follow, is for the fortification of towns. But the towns paid their taxes, well, nobody knew how. In fact, under the Norman system particularly, but probably under the Saxon also to some extent, the towns tended all to belong to the king, the crown. And he had the right to tally. That is to say, to levy a tallage with the consent of the people being taxed. And he used that as his way of getting money out of the towns. And the Normans, and the Saxons, used the system of selling charters to the towns in return for what the charters contained, which was separate jurisdictions from the shire court, because you must understand the law was run in those days on the basis of a very lucrative thing. No question of the Lord Chancellor, well, it wasn't the Lord Chancellor, but of the Lord Chancellor saying, look, it's getting too expensive. As we've seen in the papers these last few days, it would be, how much can we sell it for? Because it's very lucrative. Now, how did it come to an end then? It came to an end like this. Richard I was the absent king, always away playing games of two kinds. And he was fool enough to get himself captured by the Duke of Austria, who demanded a vast ransom. I did try and work it out. I reckon it was 2 billion. But I may not have got my figures right, because it's almost impossible. You have to use ridiculous methods. But whatever it was a colossal burden on the country. The regents who were in England raised it successfully. They managed to get the Duke to remit about, let me think, just over a tenth of it. He was freed even before it had been paid, but it was paid for by a 25% tax on everybody's revenue and chattels, except those who had less than £5. There was a rebate in the case of parish clergy who only paid 10%. Why was it possible? Well, the answer, absolutely, if you want to laugh at the drama, now's your chance. It was because Richard was so damn popular, they'd pay anything to get him back. Now, yes, well, he was succeeded in 1199, you may remember, by John. Now, poor old John, he's had a bad press. And he was very properly called Lackland because he was the fourth son of, I think Richard I was the second son of Henry II. And Henry left all his land to the elder brothers and left poor old John without a sou. I, of course, exaggerate a bit in making such vast statements of it, but that was roughly the position. Well, now, Richard I's ransom was found, and John, of course, was engaged in wars in Normandy practically the whole time. There were rising prices in England, and as the historian of the time in the Oxford History says, the elaborate fiscal and legal system of the country was turned into a merciless machine for extortion. Result, revolt by the barons, Magna Carta 1216. Now, what they did was they used Richard I's ransom collection and an earlier and an earlier levy of the same kind, which I can't remember, for levying a tax by consent instead of the feudal dues. In Henry IV's time, he came to the throne, 1216 to 1272, he came to the throne. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. There were four such levies, one in 1225 to finance campaigns in France, one in 1232 campaigns in Brittany, one in 1237 to celebrate the marriage of Henry's sister, who was only 5, I think, at the time, and also Henry's own marriage, and one for a crusade in 1269. The practice from 1225 was elastic, I'm quoting, and opened the way to the kind of taxes that were to follow. That's from the Regius Professor of History at Oxford in the necessary volume. Tradition was set, he says, for the future. And as you know, the sequel was we had customs, monopolies, ship money, drink, tobacco, and in modern coffee, tea, spices, candles, soap, paper, calico, starch, gold wire, silver coin, silver wire, I mean, salt, paths, windows, legal deeds, newspapers, pamphlets, and in modern days, theatre and cinema tickets and sales, which became VAT on everything, except what the exceptions like food. And finally, 1797, income tax, which was continuous only since 1842. Indeed, our living is taxed, our death is taxed, but, and this was the great result of Magna Carta, only by the leave of the people represented in Parliament. And I must leave out the exact way it worked, but the date that seems to matter is 1225 in Henry III's reign. Henry III came to the throne at the age of 9. He would have been 18, I think, at the time, when in return, and I quote, in return for the concession of and gift of these liberties, namely a reissue of Magna Carta, the Charter of Liberties in the Forest, it was called, the archbishops, bishops, abbots, priors, earls, barons, knights, pre-tenants, and all people of the realm had given 1/15 of all their movables. Land was not taxed. Well, I think I've said enough. Do you want some questions?
Well, thank you very much, Sir Kenneth. Who's got the first question? Mr. Gilbert.
In the economic courses, you had something to do with some years ago. We teach that in a say free land, there is always land open to use to anyone who wants to take it, provided it's got one of which is no rent, because there is no rent payable on the market. That's what the two. I wondered if you found any sense of that. So, whether there is any area available for which they notified it. I'm surprised that there's anything on Iona.
No, there wasn't a Hidage on Iona. It was Bede's assessment of what it was worth.
I think.
I'm so sorry. No, the reason it was. Sorry,
Well, that's I'm saying on false premise. I misunderstood you guys saying that if I own it, it's I think of a more margin.
No, it wasn't that. Right. Do you all hear that? Well, the answer is to the first part of the question is undoubtedly the word asthot. But you'd have to look it up. It's very difficult to follow, but roughly speaking, they were constantly carving out asthot, which was land which wasn't in use and was going to be brought into use. As to the you'd have look at Sir John Clapham's book on the economic history of England. Look at the Sir John Stenton's book, I think. But there's a book by Sawyer, which is very good on this particular aspect of it. I can't really give you any more. Now, as to the second part of the question, Iona, it was because when land was conquered or given in gift, that the conqueror or the receiver of the land at once had to decide what he could get out of it. That Bede, when Iona was given, I can't remember the exact thing, I think it was by the King of Northumbria to some other king or king of Strathclyde, probably. It was a very powerful kingdom. I haven't spoken about any of that. That's a different side of the story, the Picts and the Scots. That Bede said that Iona was worth 5 hides, which wouldn't have been tax. It would have been a sort of rental if it was a land given, or else a tribute. That's the point. And for that.
A man could find a piece of land. Oh, yeah. He could do.
I don't say it had been, there's no evidence about whether it would have been included in Hidage. I presume it would. There's what extensively.
Yes. Gentleman at the back there, could you speak up, please?
It's said that in those days people consented to, perhaps they had, that they were consulted. And I just wondered what money they paid in tax was spent on. It seemed, from what the said, that most of it was spent on defence, and that they all more or less agreed to that.
I take it you're speaking of the Anglo-Saxon early time.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, the answer is it was mostly spent on defence because that was the chief business of central government as opposed to the local government. But you'll remember that I did say, and I'll repeat it, that when Alfred was collecting tax in this way, he spent half the revenue, and that's a bit like today, on education. And of course, it had to keep up the king's household, though mostly the king's household was kept up under the feudal system by the kings going round and taking in kind the farm rent. Now, farm rent, spelled F-E-O-R-F, the farm rent was the amount that would sustain the king and his court for 24 hours or 48 hours, I can't remember, but for a given time. And in this map, there are the itineraries of the kings. I wonder if I can quickly turn them up. Of the various kings, and he's managed to get a map here somewhere. I can't find it. A map here which shows you exactly where to keep going all around the country in order to eat up the farm rent. Yes, Mr. Stratton.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I wondered if what you thought lessons were from history from I think relevant.
Of this history.
Yes, for the modern one. I think corresponds to slight evaluation with it. Personal aspect, personal.
You'll hear the question. What is the relevance today for what's been said about the modern taxation, particularly with regard to the site value rating? Is there anything, is that correct, John?
Well, I think I've made the point to this extent that it's the wrong use of the word mean. I think that is clear, isn't it? That's half the trouble and half the lesson. But the other half comes, in a sense, from a mistake that Henry George, I think, made. Henry George gave the basic lesson in economics, and he was dead right in what he was saying. But unfortunately, he made the wrong definition. He said that it consisted of man's efforts on land. He'd forgotten the first law of the universe, which was that the universe started, and thereafter everything followed suit under this law, with the one turning into three without changing the substance. The law of Trinity. Now, if you, as it were, rewrite Henry George, you don't have to rewrite anything of what he said the effects were, nor of what he said ought to be done. But if you rewrote it as wealth being created by man's efforts on his environment or on nature, though that begs a question because nature includes man. But that's the one, you see, nature. Nature consists of man and the rest of nature. They're both part of nature. But it's man on nature, using it in this restricted form. What's the connecting link? And the answer is land. Because you can't mine coal in Saudi Arabia, nor can you fetch up oil from, I'm probably wrong in saying this, from Wiltshire. No, I am wrong, yes. But you've got the point, haven't you? You've got to be on the right land to get at the right nature. That's the point. Deep water ships, flat land for aeroplanes, and all the rest, but you've got to have the land. So that it's man, nature, land, and there's your trinity. And you see the land's part of nature, and man's part of nature, and nature's part of nature. It's all words, isn't it? But they're very important. My God, they're important. Sorry.
I was trying to remember the unready or unreading meant.
Well, it's a pun, really. Ethel Red meant ready wit, really, in the old-fashioned sense, or ready wit. It's good English. It meant ready wit. So then they called him the Redless, so that he was the man with a ready wit who wasn't ready with it. It's not, I haven't done that very well, but it was a pun on his name.
I thought it might give us a clue as to why it was so disastrous.
Why what?
So disastrous a reign.
Well, he was just a bad king. He really was a rather a fool. I'm afraid I can't give you a chapter and verse for all that at all. But the great thing to get from it is that for 37 years the country had a rotten king. Everybody agrees on that. But it went on beautifully. And it was a wealthy time, and it was a well-administered time. Answer, civil service.
Is man added to nature, which what you said just now reminded me.
Yeah, yeah. We used to do that in the army command, didn't we? Yeah.
Right. Do we have another question? Mr. Jessup, speak up, please, John.
You mentioned a lot about the royal finances. You didn't mention what was the running parallel, which was the finances of the church. To what extent were they run on the same sort of basis, or were they run much more on a tax on movables, which came in later, as far as the royal institutions are concerned? In other words, that will go to the means in one sense, in the sense which you described, would go until in the third.
Yes, thank you. I don't know too much about it, actually, but I can give you half the answer. The church was provided for on a basis of regular income in Saxon times by a service, a monetary service, in return for the occupation of land. For example, you had, I think I'm right in saying, the altar penny, which every churl had to pay, and there were other things. No, not as easy as tithes. That's, I think, later. I'm not very expert in this, but there were I have it in other notes which I haven't brought with me. But there certainly was the altar penny, but there was something else that you had to pay, and I think you had to pay for the upkeep of the church too. But that's only the income. But of course, the great way that the church was paid for by the gift of land to the church by kings, by rich men, thanes, and yaziths, who were the sort of court circle, you might say, and so forth. That's the best answer I can give. It's not a very good one.
So that's the form of the
Yes.
the church.
That's right. Absolutely right. And then, of course, later on in Norman, or rather Angevin, perhaps later, in medieval times, you get the difficulty over the statutes of mort main, because the dead hand of the church, the mort main, the dead hand of the church lay on the land, and you couldn't get at it, and they had to get round it. And of course, later, no, I won't go into that.
Lady out of bed.
May I just ask an elementary question, Sir Kenneth? What's the origin of Dyke? It is the hide of a cow, because I can see the sheep was much cheaper. You see, I don't know the mystical origins of the English money and measure system, that I was not brought up in this country. Sorry.
Did you all hear that?
What was the, yes, quite, the etymology of the hide? Was it the hide of a cow, and so on? Well, the answer is I don't know, and I suspect nobody else does. If you look it up in, perhaps the best would be the full Oxford Dictionary. I think you'll find, but I haven't looked at it, so I don't know, but I think you'll find that they merely give you the Anglo-Saxon word hide without suggesting whether it's the hide of a cow. I think it'd be dangerous to say it was the hide.
I didn't find to be funny.
No. No, you're absolutely right to raise it, absolutely right. But I doubt if I think it would be dangerous to take the assonance of the two words as being an etymology. There very often are words, or let me think of one.
It feels like thought it was the skin on the sheep. I said,
Yes.
it was such a skin.
No, it may be, but not that I know. But you see, it's a bit like it's a bit like Danegeld, which is the way we normally pronounce it. Which I must say, when I was a boy, I always thought meant gold for the Danes, but it isn't. It's Danegeld, and its origin is quite different. There's always danger in assonances, I'm afraid. For example, I think I was guilty when I was young of an etymology of assonance, because I thought that cheerio must have derived through the soldiers at Gallipoli in the First World War, hearing the modern Greeks saying what in ancient Greek was "chaireota," which I don't know any modern Greek, but I think it's pronounced something like "cheriota." You see, and I thought, well, that must be the origin of cheerio. But when I put it to my headmaster, who was a very, very great linguist, he said, oh, no, no. And he said, in fact, jokingly, you must send that in for the next edition of Littleton Scott. I'm working on a dictionary myself right now.
Certainly now the taxes that were raised, but filtered down to the local villages. I mean, as you said, that all on Joe's had a flood, he can't pay much. And how is that administered? I mean, it sounds as if you were saying, as if they're doing today, it's up to the central government paying the taxation and giving to the locally what they think they ought to have. And it couldn't have been like that. And trying to how the system works.
The central government assessed each county, and you'll see it on this map here, at so many hides. Somerset, 500 hides. Essex, 2,000 hides, and so on. Go down to the shire court, and they say, oh, we're assessed at 1,000 hides. Right, we've got 900 in the county. Then I'm afraid history stops. But they had to divide the hides between the different hundreds. And I'm suggesting that they must have said, well, that part of the county is doing quite well. We'll give them 12. This part of the county is not doing so well. We'll give them 10 or 8. Do you see? And that sort of thing.
It's handed down by
Only as far as the borough, of the shires. The shires handed it down to the hundreds handed it down to the leets or villages, depending on which part of the country. Well, I'm suggesting they must have done it. It's only known. The only thing you can say as a historical fact is that it was decided in a village meeting, but you can't go further.
But in terms of the receipt of central government funds, or were they only giving central government?
They received from government in kind, in the shape of defense, very much. But they didn't have subsidies. It's like that. But you don't need subsidies if you've got a tax which varies according to your means. Because then if you've got the means, you pay the tax. If you haven't got the means, you starve. So what?
What about local tax? When people have they actually run the towns and the villages, does it have the same system, or did they have a separate process, or did they collect any at all?
They didn't have a local tax, so far as is known. So far as they may have had, but there's no record of them having a local tax on the system I've described, which is central government tax. On the other hand, I think it might be helpful, I left out a bit here, to tell you how Offa's Dyke was built. Now, if I can find it, can you find it in there? Here we are. Now, Offa and Watts Dyke is of 149 miles fortification connecting the mouth of the River Dee up by Colwyn Bay, you know, up there, with the Bristol Channel, 149 miles. The number of men required to build that 6 foot deep and 12 foot high wall is enormous. And it shows the degree of organization of Anglo-Saxon society at the time it was built. It was built during the period, you've got it on your list, of Mercian supremacy, which is, am I right in saying that 600 onwards? At a guess? No, 800. So it was built just after 800. Now the whole of England was taxed, was assessed in tax units to build it. The units linked conceptually to the productive capacity of the land through the system of hides, thulungs, carucates, or leets. So many men with tools and food had to appear on a certain day under their ealdorman at a given point where the line of the dike would already have been marked out by central government. And then central government simply said, get on with it. Now, the tax was assessed in terms of so many men or so much money per hide. For example, 1 man for every 10 hides to a 10, or a penny per hide. The total was divided between the shires. The assessment was passed down to the hundreds, and then assessment was passed by the hundreds to the villages. The collection made would be passed back up the ladder. All decisions about divisions, distribution of tax, were decided in courts, from the shire court down to the village meeting. And there would be very little paperwork. Now that is virtually a quote, well, it's a précis of that page of this book. So if you want to get it again, read that page. It's only 1 page.
The beginner would like to ask a question, Mr. Blake.
To refer back to what's said about local responsibilities, there were the kind of necessities, weren't there?
That's right.
If you'd like to elaborate on that.
Yes, the trinodal necessitas consisted of keeping the boroughs going, or a borough, your local borough going, you know, that means fort in this language, your local borough going, keeping your local bridge going, and keeping the firt going. Let's write up, could you write FYRD, it's usually spelled in English, but if you look in the Anglo-Saxon FYRD, and if you look it up in the Anglo-Saxon dictionary, you won't find it because it's spelt there FIERD, and that'll give you a better view of the pronunciation. That's right, the firt. Now, that's the levy. Now, the firt was the local defense. And I think it was Alfred who had the brilliant idea, because you couldn't take the local folk away from the land for too long, or the economy would collapse if the harvest wasn't brought in, if the seed wasn't sown, the land wasn't plowed, or whatever. So he hit on the brilliant idea of only calling out the firt half at a time. And that way he was able to keep it for double length, or a quarter at a time, in which case he could keep it for 4 times as long. And then he could use it, and that was one of his defenses against the Danes. He could then use it as an army instead of a local levy to get round the country and attack the Danes where they were weakest. That was the beginning of his success. But later he got the tax system going and hired a lot of people and had round him a more or less professional army. Where'd I got to? What am I supposed to be talking about? Oh, yeah, the primordial necessitas. Well, those are the three things. Now, they were paid for by the system of taxation that I've described, because there was, as I say, a borough Yelt, there was a Herewelt, that's the German word Herr, meaning a man, Latin vir, Celtic vir also. What was that? Oh, bridge, and there was such a thing as a bridge Yelt. I don't know how to pronounce it. It was B-R-I-G-E, G-E-L-D, but I've not been able to find it in the Saxon dictionary. I've only found it in the history book. But everybody mentions it, the brig belt, the brig yelp. In other words, the yield for keeping the bridge going. They used to think, by the way, they didn't have any bridges. They thought only the Romans had built the bridges, and when the Saxons came, they reverted to the forts.
I'm afraid this has to be the last question.
Oh dear.
I think it's time.
I take it that these demands, starting they're annual demands over a period of a reign, or I'm just thinking that that's very busy collecting all this in over the year. And if people defaulted, then it would accumulate and more be, brought forth.
Now that's a very good question, because it's one I can't answer. One doesn't know. I gave you the dates of the Danegeld that were collected in the in John's reign, didn't I? Let me go through them again. You'll see that it's every so many years. Where was it?
And I was wondering if money had different values in
Oh yes.
Say 10, and you didn't have to pay it for 5 years, then you were better off if you hadn't paid it until the 5th.
Yes. Well, now, in Henry III's time, 1225, 1232, that's 7 years, 1237, that's another 7 years, and 1269, well, that's 23 years, 24 years. But that's very late, you see. Henry III, that's 1272 to 1307. Going back into Norman times, I can say that the conqueror levied about, I've got it in other notes, levied about 4 or 5 Danegelds in his time. Going back into Saxon's time, I suspect they were much more frequent. Whether they were yearly, no, I don't think, well, I don't know anyway, let me say that. Somehow I doubt if anybody knows.
My natural sympathy at the response of Sir Kenneth to saying it was the last question led me to allow another. Oh. Well, a very short one. Too short. Turk. A late Turk.
I've not found it anywhere recorded what happened. Indeed, I have found, I think it's somewhere I've read, possibly Professor Toyn, saying that what happened ultimately over the collection of tax, nobody knows, except that they did always get a lot of tax in. Indeed, I think somebody wrote something like, one of the historians wrote something like this. Of course, there were no doubt the usual wrangles, as there always are in the tax system. So I'm afraid I don't know.
The question is, why do you not regard PAYE as a mean tax?
Did you all
It is-
hear that?
Yeah, why is PAYE not a means tax? Well, PAYE merely means an income tax which is deducted at source. So let's talk about income tax. Oh, is that all right? That's what it is, isn't it? Precisely. And your means, you see, if you take the word back to its root, means your means of getting a livelihood, your means of earning. So you see, if you don't care to earn, then you don't pay any tax. And then you have to be subsidized. So more people have to pay more tax. And it's a vicious circle. And it's the vicious circle I'm afraid we're caught in. I could go on about vicious circles, but oh, so sorry.
Thank you. Well, excuse me, I'll get my glasses. I might need them. Hope not, but you never know. Well, I suppose one thing that we could say has not been taxed is our patience this morning. This has been a remarkable, very broad, imaginative and skillful presentation. I'm wondering who's actually giving it. Was it a historian, a philologist, an economist, a philosopher, a judge, or all rolled into one? And I suppose that's what it is, really. All those talents rolled into one, which gives you or more than a glimpse of the potential of a human being to encapsulate such a magnificent armory of knowledge and information that can be imparted so easily and simply. This has been a feast, really, a feast of knowledge, a feast of research, a feast of study, a feast of the knowledge of a human being, as I said before. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm going to ask you to pronounce your verdict now, and I would like it to be the verdict of you all.